Hello, it's been a while. I've been putting new videos up for quite a bit, and I've had a few people ask me about tuning machines, especially the ones that I build. Recently someone I sold one to has just sort of started up on coils, needed to know a bit more information, so I thought I'd actually do a quick video and try and explain a few bits. This is just on general machine sort of setup and tuning. Obviously, whatever I do could be something different to what you do, but any machine has got to be sort of fine-tuned to the user's requirements. Everybody's going to be lining different speeds, shading different speeds, stuff like that. So let's go through a few bits. I'm going to do another video just on coils. Somebody asked about coils. Now, not coil machines, just the coils themselves. So I thought I'll do a separate video on that. Otherwise, it's going to get a bit too long-winded, a bit boring. So like, share, and subscribe. Watch out for the new video. See you soon on that one. Meanwhile, I've got one of my. It's like a brand new old stock short coil machines. I haven't got it set up with needles. I've just put a sort of grip in there just so I can hold it in front of the camera. Hopefully you can see that okay. Right, so I'm going to run this on 7 volts. I'm not going to do anything different for the moment. I'm on the voltage, just 7 volts, and I haven't got a foot switch. I've just got one of these plug-in switches on the actual power pack. So let's go. So you'll see what this does. Right, so that's very soft, and it's quite a big throw there. It's quite a big gap. Okay. Now I've got a standard one of my standard shader front springs on it. Now the rear spring I use is the same on every single machine that I make. That is an 18 gauge standard length spring with no bend in it. I have no bend in any of my back springs. The reason for that is because this bit here, this brass bit, I hope you can see that where I'm pointing to, this brass bit that the main spring or rear spring is bolted to, that creates the angle of the spring or tension on the spring. So if you put a spanner on that, effectively you can sort of change the angle of that. There is a bolt on the other side to lock it in place. They come pretty much preset. I mean, you might want to add more throw, more tension, and that can be done. Now let me explain quickly why I do that on my machines. So a flat main spring, as opposed to having a main spring as per, just as an example, I'm going to say a Mickey Sharp's machine, as there's a lot of them out there and they're quite popular. So a Mickey Sharp's back spring has got an actual bend in it. I think I have got a separate video on here somewhere about bending the rear springs and stuff like that, but so that has got a bend in it on the Mickey Sharp's. Now the moment you buy that machine, I'll just cover this quickly because I did cover it before, but the moment you buy any machine that's got a bend or roll in the back spring, from the moment you start using it, that bend is wearing slightly, and it's over time, might just be months, might take a couple of years or something like that, but gradually over time it's wearing out. Now eventually that machine won't do what you bought it for without replacing that main spring or renewing the bend in it. So you might as well at that point buy a new spring, because you don't want to be rebending the spring for the sake of the cost of the spring. So what you do is fit a new spring, but then you've got the problem of matching the exact bend that spring had on it when you bought it. Now the beauty of what I do, by having the tension in this piece here, that creates an angle of attack for the armature bar, so to speak, and puts tension on the front spring, and so when the front spring's touching the contact screw. So the beauty of that is you're pulling the bend into the spring, so the spring is only ever going back to its natural state, which is flat. Okay, so it hasn't you haven't tried to put a new memory into the metal sort of gains a memory, if you like. So you're just pulling the bend out of the spring and back up like that, rather than taking tension off the spring to pull it flat because you've bent the spring. Now this means if anything ever does happen to that spring, or you decide that, hang on a minute, you know, I'm going to renew the springs after a few years, you just put another spring straight in there, it's flat, you just put it in, line it up, so it's straight, and that's it. It will run exactly the same as before. No bother. Now you can then also adjust the power of that machine with voltage. You can do a lot more with voltage with a flat back spring than you can with a machine that has a bent spring, because the machine with the bent spring will have an optimum amount of power, an optimum amount of voltage it will take for the amount of tension in that spring. But because there's no actual tension in the spring of a flat spring machine, you can do a lot more with it. Now I'm going to switch this on at 7 volts, then I'm going to turn it up to 8 volts, then 9 volts and 10 volts, and we'll see what exactly happens. Bear with me, here we go. So that's it, it's still soft, that's at 7 volts. Let's turn it up to 8 volts. You can hear a bit of a slight noise change there. We've got a bit more follow through and it's faster. And there's a bit more power. Get up to 9 volts. Changing noise again. Considerably more power. Certainly over the 7 volts. Quite a lot more power. Now these are only short springs, so we don't want to overload short coils. So there is a point where you can overload them. Let's take it up to 10 volts, which is probably too much for small coils. Yeah, you wouldn't want to go any higher than that. I wouldn't want to go any more than about 9.5 volts on these. Not on these short coils, it might heat up a little bit. Now, let's see if I can take it up to about 11, 11.5 and see if we can notice a change in the noise. Hang on, here we go. Now that's up to 12. And it started to sound a little bit crap. It started to reverberate a bit, so the spring's sort of bouncing around a little bit on itself, so the spring itself is fluttering. And to be honest with you, you just don't need that amount of power. So, and that would just heat the coils up eventually and probably burn them out, because it would melt some of the enamel off the coating of the coil wire. I will discuss that in the coil section. Like, share and subscribe, and then you'll find out when that video will be up. Actually, I'm going to try and do that today while I'm out here anyway. So let's put this back to 7 volts. Actually, let's put it on 7.5. So this is how it's running at the moment, and that's quite a decent throw. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave the volts as they are, but I'm going to close the throw with the contact screw, and you see what happens. There you go. Now that's quite a lot faster, still the same voltage, but what's happening now is it's still the same amount of power in this. So there's no extra power in there because I haven't added any more voltage, but it is going faster, and the reason it's going faster is quite simple. The armature bar hasn't got as far to travel up and down. Now this is measured in cycles per second, or hertz as it were. So if you've got a machine that reads in CPS or HZ, that's showing you how many times this is making an up and down and up movement per second. So if you're reading 115, that is going up and down 115 times per second. If you hold it up to the light, if you look at it in the light, you can see, you'll be able to see, believe it or not, the optimum performance of the machine by looking at this front spring when it's running. Actually, it doesn't happen all the time, but you can have a look at that front spring when it's running, and as you can see, so that's pretty much, you're not going to see this on camera at all. It won't show it, but while it's running, you can see the spring in the bottom position and the top position. When it's at optimum speed, you'll also see it in the middle. That's the wavelength of any lights you've got in the room at 50-60 hertz versus the amount of cycles per second. That's why you will see that ghost of the spring in the middle. I wouldn't worry too much about that, to be fair. I used to get a bit hooked up on it, but the reality of it is that you need that machine to run as you want it. So when the machine arrives, it'll be, if you ordered it as a liner or a shader or a hybrid, that's how I think it should be set up. But the way I think it should be set up is not always the way you want it to be set up. I know plenty of people that have bought shaders from me and they're using them as liners because they like a slow, long throw line. So you would have to slow your work down at that point. You would have to slow your lines down. Whereas if you've got a fast, hard liner, then you want to make sure you're going quite quick. You don't want your lines blowing and stuff like that, as I'm sure probably every tattooist ever has blown some lines on their own leg when they're trying out new techniques or a new machine, or when they were first starting out and they're tattooing their own legs. We've all done it. I've got blown lines on my legs. It's a disgrace. All the blue sort of hue in the background and the shadow in the background just because you've hung around too long and you thought it would be a great idea for the machine to be running as hard as possible. So look, the next thing I want to say is, with regards to some of the tuning I do, I use tuning on the armature bars. Now, here's two different armature bars. These armature bars are the same length. If you see at the back bit there, can you see that I've carved a piece out? Oh, you can just see in the reflection of my face there. So this one has got a piece cut out here. Now what happens then is, when that's on a machine, that effectively makes this gap here between where the spring is bolted to and the back of the armature bar, that makes that gap longer. On things like Mickey Sharp's, that is a tiny little gap. There's only a small space where that spring is flexing, and especially if you've got some of these skinny little American springs that they use, that makes for an unreliable sort of spring, really. I prefer to have quite a lot of bounce in the this section here. Needs to be quite a big gap there between the back of the armature bar there. The bigger that gap, the more bouncy that machine is going to be. So you can make more of a hybrid machine. You probably don't want a big gap there if you're just looking for a liner machine. So that covers sort of like the tuning that I do with the armature bar. Now, just so you know, both those armature bars are exactly the same length. It's just that I have a piece carved out on the darker of the two armature bars. Typically, the flat one will be used for lining and the one with the carve out for shading. Now somewhere in the middle, for a hybrid, that will do both, and with just some minor adjustments with voltage and throw. So when I say throw, I mean that's your gap, but the actual throw can be adjusted by the contact screw. Okay, so there's going to be people that say, oh, there's the throw, there's the air gap, there's a contact gap. The reality of it is the throw is how much movement there is between the armature bar and the top of the coil. That is your throw. That is how much it is moving that needle up and down, regardless of the contact gap, the air gap. It doesn't matter. That movement is your throw. Alright, cheers, thanks. Alright, just had a delivery, wasn't worth stopping the video. Okay, so, sorry about that. So, yeah, so what we need to get used to is adjusting that front screw, the contact screw, along with your voltage for optimum settings, for the power you need, for the amount of needles you're driving. You don't want to overload on the power if you're running 3 or 5 needles for lining, because you don't want a massive amount of power. You don't want to blow the you don't want to blow your lines. Now, the other one thing I wanted to just cover quickly with the springs. My machines, I only have two length of front spring there. I have a 37.5mm and a 42mm. They're both 18 gauge. I tend to use the 42mm, which is obviously longer, a little bit more bouncy. I tend to use that on the shader. Okay, and the shorter spring obviously makes the machine faster. The reason for that is there's less flex because it's shorter, so the armature bar won't travel up quite so far under tension when it hits the contact screw, so it does make for a slightly faster machine. I like to mix a short spring with an armature bar with the cutout on it, and that will give me much more of a hybrid machine, which allows you to use it for lining and shading, same machine, with just a tweak of voltage and obviously the gap to suit. Some people prefer a shorter throw for lining and a slightly bigger throw for shading and stuff like that. And then it's just a question of getting the power right. Obviously, you know what, I haven't got this loaded up with needles. I haven't got any needles. But once you put your needles and bands onto the machine, that will slow it up. So, you know, you could run a machine at 7 volts with nothing in it, and then once you've put your needle and bands on at 7 volts, it will do basically nothing. That's when you've got to, you know, add some voltage. But I also know people that have just thought, you know what, let's put 12 volts in and stuff like that, and when wondered why they burnt the machine out or burnt the contact out, or, you know, almost made a hole in the bottom of the armature bar where it's been hitting the front coil. That's madness. The last thing you want to do is overload the machine. The coils will heat up, you risk burning them out, you'll damage your contact screw, your front spring, all sorts of stuff like that. And I'm rattling on a bit now, and this video is nearly 20 minutes long, so let's call it a day there. If you've got any questions, ask me the questions in the notes underneath the video on YouTube here, and I will answer everybody. I'll try to get back to everybody eventually in person. I don't have a problem with that. If it's genuine questions and I can help, then I will. Right, we're nearly at 20 minutes, so like, share, subscribe. I'll see you soon. Watch out for my next video, which is going to be on coils. Thanks for looking, and stay safe. Have a good day. Thank you very much. Take care.